this is, of course, not the first time that President Xi has addressed Davos, and I always sort of hark back to that first and most impactful speech that he gave. What's really changed between now and then? And did he sort of canvass all of the major issues that really threaten economic stability and geopolitical stability, not just for China, but for its major trading partners as well?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it was an interesting speech. I mean, as you know, this is the third time he's addressed the summit. He started in 2017. In each case, he's made the case for himself and China being really a beacon for multilateralism and economic engagement, kind of globally together addressing common challenges, which was notable last time he presented because that was such a counterpoint to the U.S. administration at the time. I think what's notable here is he is making a contrast between what he is saying China is doing internationally, right? Vaccine diplomacy, the big infrastructure investments through the Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera, versus what the U.S. is driving, which is more, as he said, zero sums and exclusive groups like AUKUS and the Quad is what he's implying. But I think the issue is really, while he's touting China's economic growth, and indeed it did have over 8% growth last year, that growth is slowing. And the economic challenges, as you know, are real for China. The pandemic purchases that have driven exports out of China are slowing. They just announced yesterday statistics where growth is actually slowing down. It was only 4% in this past quarter. And they have demographic challenges as well, and now they're trying to drive a zero COVID policy. So they actually have quite a lot of challenges that he probably doesn't want to highlight too aggressively in a speech like that.
Right, and because we know even though he's addressing the Davos crowd, there's that political audience that he's speaking to as well, right? We know that his dominance is not something that's going to be questioned going into the party congress and the two sessions. But beyond that, do we expect to see the same level of dominance, the sort of intensity of the ability to push through policy making that we've seen in the previous year?
Yeah, I mean, the party Congress that's coming up, indeed, there is absolutely no doubt that he's going to get a third term. There's no doubt that he's already consolidated power. He is, front and center. It's going to matter less who is picked for other positions in terms of that changing policy. Rather, that's going to reflect his dominance and his policy priorities. But I think the things to watch in this Congress coming up later in the year, of course, are any note to possible succession plans, who exactly is coming up in the ranks. But I think the real big question to watch for is, he has driven some pretty aggressive regulatory crackdowns in areas like tech, real estate, the education sector, et cetera, to move from the growth for growth's sake policy to a sustainable growth policy. He's really trying to reshape the economy. So the question is, as he's been taking these short-term risks and, some could argue damaging the Chinese economy for long-term gain, is that going to continue? Are we going to see through the rest of this year, 2022 is really going to tell us, is he going to double down on that aggressive kind of crackdown on businesses, or is he going to kind of dial it back because growth is indeed being impacted? So those are the kinds of things to watch in the run-up to the Party Congress later in the year, and then also as an outcome of it.
Also happening in November is another domestic political exercise. We're talking about the U.S. midterms, of course. Is it too early to start extrapolating the scenarios for that and what that might mean also for the relationship between the two?
Yeah, great question. It's a little bit early to forecast too strongly about what might actually happen in the U.S. midterms. It is true Biden is having a very hard time. His approval ratings are down. COVID's a problem. He couldn't pass the Build Back Better plan. So indeed, we may see a situation where Republicans take the House and Senate. We may see a mix. It's hard to imagine the Democrats would actually hold both houses. So I would think regardless, his hands are going to be a little bit more tied domestically. I do think that in the run-up to the election, while in the states it's already a very strong popular tone that we need to be tough on China, that's probably the only bipartisan issue where people agree that the U.S. needs to be tough on China. That's going to only ratchet up as we get closer to the election and candidates kind of compete to be even tougher on China. So I do think, while we've seen the U.S. and China relationship become more cordial since the Biden administration took power, indeed the underlying drivers have not changed, and possibly they could even solidify further. And so that's going to be, really an area of continued strong competition, let's say, an area of tension, which is going to really, can really hamper China and what it's trying to do internationally as well, because all eyes are on China and everything that happens, including in the business community, which is worried about these issues as well, of course. Everything is looked at through the lens of national security on both sides. So it does keep businesses a bit hamstrung in trying to think about how they're going to expand and how both countries are going to grow economies, because everything in business is also so fraught with these geopolitics.
Right. And the risk, Angela, is this, in a lot of ways, overshadows everything else that might also be important. Everything from elections in South Korea, North Korea, we're talking Ukraine. An almost impossible question, obviously, so thank you in advance. What else are you watching? What else is brewing out there?
Yeah, well, as we look at the geopolitical issues in 2022, again, there are a couple of events. Again, the Party Congress in China later in the fall. You mentioned South Korea elections coming up in March, which, it's a very tight race and will take the country in, one of two different trajectories. But as we look at control risks, as we've just published our annual risk map for 2022, the issue is less any specific event or election we're watching, and more the broader issue of how are governments in Asia and globally going to continue to manage the COVID situation, climate change and energy transition, and what that means for economic recovery, because that is where we see potential for domestic unrest. We see potential for government popularity issues, potentially governments changing. Of course, economic recovery on the back of how governments are choosing to change supply chains, allow movement of goods and people or not. And so it's really those kind of broad thematic issues and how governments are going to capably or not manage those that's really going to drive some of the geopolitical issues as well in 2022.